Are democracies doomed? Abraham Lincoln said, "Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people." And Winston Churchill joked, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Since Lincoln's Civil War presidency, the United States now has the largest, richest, and most powerful military the world has seen, upholding a narrative of supporting and championing democracy both at home and abroad. And yet, in this 21st century, two Harvard professors of government found themselves asking a question they never hoped to ask. Is American democracy at risk? How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. First published in 2018, this book looks to answer certain questions such as how do democracies fall into the hands of authoritarian leaders? Once in power, how do authoritarian leaders change the game, allowing them to destroy the democracy from within? How can we stop authoritarians coming to power in the first place? And why is President Donald Trump particular cause for concern? A main point of the book that the authors stress is that the way in which democracies die has changed. During the Cold War, most democracies fell at the hands of men with guns, through military coups, but since the end of the Cold War, democracies now die through elections. To help us understand how authoritarians come to power, they use an Aesop's fable: the horse, the stag, and the hunter. A quarrel rises between a horse and a stag, and so the horse turns to the hunter for help, who agrees on the condition that he may place an iron bridle between its jaws and saddle on its back so he may ride and steer the horse. The horse agrees, and with the hunter's help, they overcome the stag. But once done, the horse turns to the hunter and says, "Now get off me and remove these things from my mouth and back." "Not so fast, friend," says the hunter, "for I have you now under bit and spur, and prefer to keep you as you are." They use this analogy alongside historical references, such as 1920s Italy, 1930s Germany, and 1990s Venezuela. The authors argue that in all these instances, mainstream politicians during times of crisis hope to tap into the popularity of a radical outsider, or demagogue, believing they could control them, and once they have used them for their own political gain, cast them aside. However, by engaging with these figures, they open the door to mainstream politics and make them legitimate figures. The authors argue that the deal backfires, that these figures cannot be controlled, cannot be cast aside, and once in power, use the democratic institutions to dismantle them from within and establish themselves as authoritarian leaders. The question then rises, how do we recognize these would-be authoritarians on the horizon? Here the authors build upon the work of Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who was born in Weimar, Germany and raised amid Spain's civil war. Building on his work, they devise 4 warning signs in a figure's behavior. 1. They reject in words or actions the democratic rules of the game. 2. They deny the legitimacy of their opponents. 3. They tolerate or encourage violence. 4. They indicate a willingness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. The authors say that a politician who meets even one of these conditions is cause for concern, and that the kinds of candidates that tend to meet it tend to be populist outsiders. This is an anti-establishment figure who claims to represent the voice of the people and wages war on what they depict as a corrupt system run by a conspiratorial elite. During times of struggles for democracies, Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that it may be tempting for mainstream politicians to try and save what control they have by endorsing a charismatic outsider emerging on the scene, but rival political parties must put aside their rivalries and refuse to cooperate with these figures and make sure that there are checks and balances in place to stop any would-be authoritarian dismantling the democratic institutions if they are elected. The authors spend time demonstrating how the US has an impressive record in both Republican and Democratic cases in confronting extremist figures on the fringes of their parties, and for decades succeeded in keeping them out of mainstream politics, until 2016. A second point that the authors make is that once a demagogue is in power, the game has changed. They outline in Chapter 4 of their book the ways in which an elected demagogue, once in office, looks to consolidate power. They argue they do so by capturing the referees, sidelining key players, and rewriting the rules to tilt the playing field against their opponents and in their favour. What concerned the authors, and was much of their motivation for writing the book, was that they believed Donald Trump met all 4 of the warning signs and made these attempts to consolidate power. Having studied the decay of democracies elsewhere in the world, they felt like they had seen this film before, but this time it was happening in the US. The authors go through how he met these conditions and write an authoritarian report card for Trump, revealing how, in his election campaign and first year in office, his words and actions point to what they argue is an alarming lack of willingness to play by the democratic rules of the game. To give some of the well-known instances, he battled with the would-be referees of the American political system, trying to use the intelligence agencies as a shield as he came under investigation for his campaign's ties with Russia, by making sure those in charge were loyal to him. When he met with resistance, he looked to purge and punish those who acted independently, for example firing FBI Director James Comey. Perhaps his most famous of catchphrases, fake news, is also discussed to show how Trump's attack on the media went beyond any usual contempt a politician may unsurprisingly have for his critics, even going so far as labeling the media the enemy of the people in 2017. Regarding the legitimacy of his opponents, we now associate his claims of a rigged election to 2020, but he made the same claims back in 2016 despite winning, claiming to have won the popular vote. He often discredited the legitimacy of his opponents, frequently making reference to Hillary Clinton being a criminal who should be locked up, as well as questioning Barack Obama's right to have run for president over his birth certificate. The willingness to tolerate or encourage violence was shown clearly to all the world on January the 6th, 2021, with the March on the Capitol, but the authors show how long before this the warning signs were there. A final point that the authors make that is perhaps their most crucial is that the US Constitution is not enough to save American democracy by itself. The Constitution works best when it is upheld by 2 key unwritten norms: mutual toleration and forbearance. Mutual toleration means that we accept the legitimacy of opponents, that no matter how much we may disagree and dislike our political rivals, we accept publicly and privately that they have an equal right to compete for office, and if they win, to govern. In summary, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. Forbearance is a little more complicated, but it essentially means self-restraint in using all the political power that is legally available. They show how the President of the United States can legally use his constitutional authority for personal and political benefit. The presidential pardon can be used to help allies. They can go around Congress to make policy and use the executive order, and if they have a congressional majority, they can expand the Supreme Court and fill it with supporters. They also show how Congress and the Senate have great power potential. Congress can refuse to fund the government and effectively shut it down, and the Senate can block all of the president's cabinet and judicial picks and stop them from filling a Supreme Court vacancy. All of this is completely legal. Politicians can use the Constitution to throw a democracy into crisis, and what prevents the US constitutional system from descending into a deadlock, dysfunction, or maybe even authoritarianism is forbearance. The authors describe these as the soft guardrails of democracy. They help prevent normal political competition spiral out of control and make elections feel like a fight to the death and a crisis every time they come around. In the United States, these democratic norms have been unraveling, but Trump is not the cause. He is a symptom. In the last 25 to 30 years, mutual toleration has been on the decline, accelerating particularly in the 2000s, with Obama running for president. In the US, rivals are being seen more and more as enemies. The authors argue that this is so dangerous because it encourages abandoning forbearance. Because if you believe your rivals really are enemies and will destroy the country you love if they come to power, you will use every available option to you to stop them. You may ask, why is this happening? And for this, perhaps more than any other reason, I would urge you to read the book. They argue that polarization has risen in America due to a number of factors. One is the change in the way that the parties now pick their leaders, which is more open but makes it easier for demagogues to enter politics. Another is the effect of the Civil Rights Act on the demographic of the two parties. The Republican Party has stayed predominantly white, unlike the Democrats. Where once the parties disagreed on common things, such as government spending and foreign policy, they now disagree on matters of identity, such as race, religion, gun rights, abortion, and sexual identity. In America, certain groups feel as if they are losing the country they grew up in and that their very identities are at risk, causing a decline in mutual toleration and abandoning of forbearance. And so, to conclude, I would urge anyone watching this to read this book. It was surprisingly accessible. A book on democracies and how they die and political processes was written in such a way by the authors that you do not need to have a political background to be able to understand and appreciate this book, and maybe even enjoy it. Also, knowing that this book was published in 2018, it was particularly interesting reading it now, after things like COVID, the 2020 election, and the January 6th march on the Capitol. Reading this book and the warning signs about Trump written back then puts things into perspective now. I would also point out that this book is not a left-wing liberal attack on the Trump presidency and all Republicans. It is not a doomsday book that paints Trump as an American Hitler. What it does is go through historical examples about how American politics has changed. But they remain hopeful for the future of democracy in America. I think the more valuable parts of the book that I take away are the warning signs in leaders and the effects of increased polarization. If we look elsewhere in the world, Britain and Europe, polarization is also wearing down mutual toleration. Do we have conversations with our rivals, or do we only engage with them in comment sections and angry posts on social media? In the United Kingdom, a general election is coming. We still do not know when, but it is coming. And the American election of 2024 should maybe be the perfect reason to read this book. As Trump seems to be making his way towards the 2024 American election, think of issues like Ukraine and the Middle East and how, depending on who the president of the United States is, things can change dramatically. Overall, I highly recommend this book and think anyone could enjoy it. And should you read it, you may find yourself watching the US election with keener eyes. Thank you for watching.